Okay, in this video we are going to discuss Linux architecture. Before discussing Linux architecture, we need to know operating system, and shortcut we call OS, operating system. So basically operating system is interface between user and computer hardware. It's like a middleman between user and computer hardware. Number of software apps run on operating system to manage hardware resources. We run many applications like PDF. Now I'm running. You can run browser. You can run Microsoft Office, and all these applications we run on operating system to manage the hardware resources. So basically operating system is a system software. There are two type of software. One is system software, another is application software. So operating system is a system software. They manage computer hardware and software resources, and it's like a middleman between user and computer hardware. So operating system is a software which act as an interface between computer hardware component and user. Every computer system must have at least operating system to run the program. Without operating system, it's like a human body without soul. So when there is no soul, so the person will die and the body is useless. So this body is like a hardware, and inside the soul is like a operating system in our body. Okay, so this is called operating system. It is not possible for user to use any computer or any mobile device without operating system. And I told you it's like a soul of an human. So without this soul, it's not possible. So without operating system, you cannot use any computer system or mobile. It's require operating system. Okay, so these are the user. They are using different application. It can be compiler, it can be a text editor, it can be assembler, it can be database system, it can be any application. So they are accessing application going to operating system interact with a computer hardware. So main role of operating system is to provide interface to user to interact with hardware. So it's like a middleman here. Next thing, a hardware. In architecture, the first thing is hardware. Hardware, we know all physical devices attached to Linux operating system is called hardware. It can be hard disk, it can be RAM, it can be motherboard, it can be CPU, it can be CD-ROM, it can be any sort of RAM and anything. All these which we can touch them and which is called hardware, and which is attached to operating system is called hardware. Next thing in architecture is kernel. So basically what is kernel? It is a core component of operating system which interact directly with hardware. So this is the person who interact with hardware. Okay, so kernel is the core of Linux operating system which interact directly with hardware. So this is the guy who interact with hardware to get the job done. So it means in Linux operating system, kernel is the layer directly on the top of hardware. And if I have here is, so this is the hardware like a CD-ROM, DVD, hard drive, motherboard, and all those things. So this is the hardware of Linux. Top of them there is a kernel. Okay, and this kernel is on the top of hardware. So he is the responsible person to interact with hardware. We call them kernel in Linux. So it means it is a necessary module required to deal with underlying hardware device. So this is the guy who has to interact and deal with hardware. So kernel is one of the core section of operating system responsible for each of major action in operating system, and that's why it's like a kernel in army. So here's the top authority to interact with the operating system, not this one. We will discuss they do beside this interaction. Kernel can do some more job as well. A bit later we will discuss. So if I say kernel is a core component of any operating system which directly interact with hardware. Again, interaction with hardware. So it means kernel is to manage the communication between software and hardware. And this software can be operating system and it can be any other application. So this kernel provide communication between your operating system and hardware. It's again like a middleman. So if I say kernel can make communication between the hardware and software possible. This the person, the middleman, who make possible to communicate between hardware and software. Normally, kernel is the first part to load when Linux operating system boot up. Whenever you start your operating system Linux, so kernel will boot up first and it will load to the RAM and it will be there all the time to serve you. Now beside this one, kernel is also responsible for efficient management of system resources. I told you kernel can do beside the interaction what they do, the efficient management of system resources. System resources like a memory management, process management, task management and disk management. So these management activity is handled by kernel. So kernel do mainly two things. One, your interaction between operating system and hardware. Second is efficient management of system resources. These two are the job of kernel. Then another in architecture, basically we are discussing Linux architecture. There are four things involved. Hardware, we discuss what is hardware. Kernel, we discuss two things. And the third one is shell. So let's go to shell. What is shell? Now shell is an interface which take input from user and send instruction to the kernel. It means now shell is an interface which take instruction and command from user like you and me. You need to put your instruction. Shell will take these instructions to kernel. Kernel will take them to hardware. We already discussed about kernel. So it's like a circle. Now shell take the output from the kernel and send the result back to output as well. Yeah, it's also true. So shell will send our input to kernel and also they will get the output from kernel and will display us on command prompt. So again it's taking and display the output. So this is the role of shell. So it means Linux shell is interactive command line interface where user type a command. We will discuss command later. It's taking our command, our instruction from user. The user get its result and Linux shell top of Linux operating system kernel. They will take your instruction, your command, and they will take them to the kernel, and also they will take the answer and will display to you. So shell can take the input from keyboard and it can be from file as well, by the way. So shell is taking input from keyboard and from file to take them to the kernel. So if I say shell is a command language interpreter which execute command and read from input. Again the same thing. End of the day, it's like an interpreter. It's taking our command and execute them and take our input from keyboard, and it can be from file. Keep in mind, shell is not part of the system kernel, but use system kernel to execute program. So shell basically use the system kernel, which we discuss about what is kernel, to execute the program. It's taking instruction from us and give it to the kernel. By default, and most Linux default shell is bash shell. We will see this one, bash shell. You can use this command to find out which shell you are using. You can use echo $0, or you can use echo an uppercase shell to find out which shell you are using. There are many shell. Some of the shell are like Koran shell, Boran shell, C shell, and Fosic shell. There are many other shell as well, but most famous one and by default in Linux is this one, bash shell. So it means shall take the command from user and execute kernel function. And these are some of the example. So this is our hardware, this is the kernel, this is the operating system, and this is the shell, this is the terminal, and this is the user. User give input and terminal pass to shell pass to work with kernel, and kernel work with hardware. So these are the layer. Now another thing, and this for architecture of Linux: hardware, kernel, shell, and application. Either we call them utility as well. Application, utility, shell, kernel, and hardware. We discuss about hardware, the physical part, then we discuss kernel, then we discuss shell. Now coming to application or utility. Utility program that provides user most of the functionality of operating system, like a browser, like a Microsoft Office, text editor. All those are called utility or program or application. So basically the system utility program is responsible for doing specialized level and individual activity. Every application do different job for us. Various command and utility which can make use of day-to-day activity is called programs, application, utility. Linux operating system come with terminal that user can use to pass command to shell. I already told you. You need to type as a user, you need to use terminal. Suppose you say mkdir to make a folder. Terminal will pass to shell. Shell will interact with kernel. Kernel will use the hardware and provide you back, and shell will take and it will display you that yes, folder is created. But for this purpose you can use different program. If I go to Linux, so in Linux there are many application for different purpose, and also you can use terminal. So ABC@12345. So if I go to activities and if I go to application, so these are the application, either utilities. So utility are used to make user program and make the work easy in the Linux. Definitely different utility use different functionality, and for different purpose we can use them. And the application program give the user most of the functionality of the operating system. So we already know. So that's the architecture of Linux. First thing is hardware, then there is a kernel, then shell, and then we have application. It can be compiler, it can be application, there can be commands, it can be utility, and these are the user. So user send, and they are using these application, they are using terminal to give instruction, shell take those instruction to give it to kernel, kernel use the hardware and give answer back to shell, shell give answer back to the user. So that's the way how Linux working. So these are the layer of the what is called Linux. So user utility program they are using, then there is standard library, then operating system and hardware. Now we need to find out what is called to kernel, which kernel you are using. So you can use these three different commands to find out. So let me type putty and take access to my Linux. Okay, what is my IP address? Is better to access from there. Fconfig, and let me type this IP to get SSH, so it will be easy for us. Okay, and now I need to log in root, and password I set on my Linux is abc@12345. So now I'm here. I need to type uname -r. So this my kernel, it will show you the kernel 4.18.0305, and this the architecture. So this is my kernel. So the first thing is 4. So 4 is basically kernel version. So I'm using version 4 kernel. 18 is the major revision, 0 is the minor revision, and 308 is patch level all number. So 4.18.0305, this one. So this is the kernel which you can find your Linux kernel. Okay, another thing is to find out your shell. Okay, for kernel, by the way, there are some other command as well. If you don't want to use that one, so there is cat and then process and then version. Again the same thing. So that's the 4.18.0, and it's mentioned here again. So you can use this command as well. The last command, if you want to find out the kernel, is hostname ctl, and then you can say that only show me kernel, so it will show you the kernel. So now they say the kernel is Linux 4.18.0305, and this the 8664 architecture. And I already told you what is 4. So it's a kernel version, 18 is major revision, 0 is minor revision, and 305 is the number, page number. So these are the three commands if you want to find out your kernel information. If you want to find out your shell information, so for that you can use echo and then a $, where is $, and 0, sorry, $ and 0. So let's say you are using bash shell. I told you by default is a bash shell, and there are many shell I told you. And also you can use a $, by the way, where is echo and $, and you can type shell in uppercase. So again it will show you. Okay, sorry, I put 4, it's $, by the way. Here is. So these two commands you can use. They say bash, and also it say bin and bash. It's okay, it's a bash, by the way. So we are using a bash shell if you want to find out bash shell. And if you want to find out your operating system, which operating system you are using, so you can use cat and etc and os, where is an os release. That's the command. So if I go here, so it say that a Red Hat Enterprise Linux and version 8.4 we are using. Okay, this a Fedora anyway, this 8.4 version, and this the platform and Red Hat Enterprise 8.4, and these are the detail if you want to access them. So if you want to find out your operating system, so this the command which you can use. So we discuss operating system, and we found out how we can know about our operating system. Then we discuss shell. So this the two command which you can use to find out the shell information. And then we discuss about the kernel. So these are the three command which you can find out the kernel information. So this is called architecture, Linux architecture, hardware, kernel, shell, application. And if you say there is a fifth user, you can involve user as well. So user give instruction using application, different compiler, terminal, give instruction to shell, shell pass them to kernel, kernel pass them to hardware. Hardware the process and give it to kernel, kernel give it to shell, and this way we get the detail back in our screen. So this is called Linux architecture.